Listen-only mode.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. We're now into 2018, and we're presenting this as part of the webinar series for the New Jersey Manufacturing Extension Program. Today, our presenter is going to be Hart Brown, who's the Executive Vice President of Firestorm, and we're talking about how to make the most of 2018. Hart, if you could advance the slides. Sure. Figure out how to, okay, there we go. We invite you to connect with Firestorm in a variety of ways, all the way from LinkedIn to Twitter to Facebook and even our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of recorded webinars that are out there on the YouTube channel that you can look at. And there's even a hashtag for this session. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Our attorneys like us to point out that today's exercise is not complete without the accompanying oral comments, and this work product should be discussed and read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. Please don't interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. We use a PREDICT.PLAN.PERFORM model, and we have expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Our President, Jim Satterfield, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Firestorm. We had some changes about a year ago where Firestorm was actually acquired by another company. We have a parent company now, Novume, and Novume has now been approved for listing on Nasdaq. We invite you to become a shareholder if you would like to, and you'll be able to become part of the family that way. It's nice to be listed and have those opportunities. Our presenter today is our very own Hart Brown. Hart is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Firestorm. He has extensive experience. He looks like he's only about 30 years old, but Hart really has 20 years experience in all phases of security crisis management around the world. I mean, if you look at his resume, you think, oh my goodness, this guy must be about 80 years old. But we're delighted to have Hart with us today. And we're also delighted to have the New Jersey MEP with us today. We've got Joe Caratanuto, and we'll let Joe make some comments and some nice things to say about the New Jersey MEP, and then we'll hear from our very own Blair Neville. Joe?
Thanks, Bill. Yes, for those that aren't familiar, New Jersey Manufacturing Extension Program, our mission is actually to work with small and mid-sized manufacturers in the state to help them become more productive, more efficient, and more globally competitive. And we do it through a host of different services that we provide. And usually the process starts with an assessment where we really get a better understanding of the manufacturer's business and the different challenges, areas of strength and opportunity. And we are able to focus on areas where clients would like to improve their efficiency either through things like lean manufacturing, Six Sigma, process improvement. We also get involved in compliance with things like ISO certification and certifications in the respective industries, food, medical device, aerospace. And in addition, of course, we get involved in things like strategic planning and business development. We have a whole group of growth services that we can provide to organizations. And of course, we get involved in business continuity planning, which is where we got connected with Firestorm many years ago and have been working to help organizations put together plans to survive crises and continue their operations. So that's how we got connected. Blair, over to you.
Great, Joe. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. And I just want to, take 1 second and just say thank you to the MEP for their support. This area of preparedness, crisis management, business continuity is growing in awareness and growing in importance, and I really appreciate, I think Firestorm and our clients appreciate the support that the MEP has taken on board to help us with this webinar series, and also, introducing us to their clients to help them through the planning process and response process. So again, our relationship is growing, and definitely appreciate the support of Joe and his team. Hart?
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Blair. And I appreciate all of you joining us that are on the webinar today. And one of the themes as we get into 2018, and many of you that have plans, policies, procedures in place, now is a good time, and in many cases, as we write into those plans, you may have a date. And if in January of each year, then this is certainly a good time and to review all of those policies, plans, procedures, and make sure that they're updated. Interestingly enough, on the Firestorm side, we do the same thing. And so we're constantly looking at trends in the industries, in the space, from a crisis management perspective, from a security perspective, from an intelligence perspective, from others that you're going to see. And we review all of our processes as well to make sure that we're matching what the types of things that we're likely to see going into 2018, and that we're best positioned to handle those crises on behalf of many of the people that we work with. And so as we go through, we'll be talking a little bit about certainly what we're doing internally and allowing you to use that process as a checklist for you to start thinking about what do we need to incorporate, change, or improve with our plans, policies, procedures, insurance programs, risk management programs, and others, that you're more prepared if and when an event were to occur. One of the things as we get into the conversation is looking at this quote from Winston Churchill, and you see these kinds of themes that have played out throughout the ages, that when a crisis occurs, there is now a fork in the road. And that fork in the road presents challenges, and it also presents opportunities. Those that are able to capitalize that on the opportunities and certainly advance themselves potentially faster, become more resilient than competitors, or provide services that are needed at those points in time, can turn the tide for their organizations. We see that in the business sense, we see that in the stock market, we see that in how organizations perform. But it's that one moment in time that becomes critically important for us to understand. And as you see throughout this conversation, we're trying to, as much as we can, peel the onion back and get to the core of what crisis management is, and get to that moment, that fork in the road, to make sure that we're prepared. And this quote helps us to do that, to think through what that's going to mean for us. And so one of the themes that we'll be reviewing, and this will continue to be a theme as we talk about this concept, but is that fork in the road really comes down in many cases to one person. One person in your organization that either sees the crisis coming, that gets the phone call, the unfortunate phone call that something just occurred that now can be important to us, but that one person and the decisions and the emotions and the situation that that person is pushed into becomes very complex. And we want to understand that person as much as we possibly can, get that first person perspective, and make sure our plans, policies, and procedures wrap around that person to make sure that that person is prepared as you possibly can. It's very difficult to prepare everybody for every type of eventuality, but as prepared as you possibly can to be successful in that moment. And we'll talk about what that means as we move forward, but it is that moment in time and the decisions we make at that moment that can be very important to us. It really sets the tone for the entire situation, whether that be a continuity or a crisis or whatever disruptive event that may have occurred to you and your organizations. So when we apply that same concept, that first person concept, is to understand that the types of things, and you may have heard this over time, but the types of things that we prepare people for to be successful in the business environment, whatever environment you're in, whether that be healthcare, education, manufacturing certainly is a big point of what we're talking about today. But thinking through the types of training that we have traditionally provided to be successful in business may not be the same types of things that we would prepare somebody for crisis. And certainly in my experience in dealing with many of these cases throughout the years, some quite large events, many of the business leaders and organizations I talk to and work through these events with them, the first thing that they come back and tell me is Hart, they just didn't teach us this in business school, or they didn't teach us this in getting ready to be prepared for this job or this industry or this career. And this is one of the challenges when you're faced with a crisis, is we're not seeing them at fast enough pace from a personal perspective to be able to incorporate that. So recognizing that it's not business as usual, that things are going to change, that we need to think differently in those early phases of a crisis. For us on the planning side, when we're beginning to structure this out in a crisis, thinking through that first person response. What is it that you would want that individual to do in the first few moments, and we're going to talk for a minute in the first hour, but as early as possible, does that person, do they know where to go with that information? Are they able to make decisions, or do they need to bring other people in at that moment in time? And how do we scale the response, either from a continuity perspective, crisis perspective? How do we scale the response to make sure it's adequate for what it is we're trying to accomplish? The faster we can make those moves in the early stages of a crisis, the better off we are. What we find in many cases, and again, peeling back the onion to get to the core of what we're all about here, is that many of those people aren't fully prepared for that moment. And the delays that we see in the plans, policies, procedures have an impact that follows the entire crisis event. And so we want to make sure that we set those expectations, set the responsibilities, and make sure that the procedures match what it is we want those individuals to do, and follow that up with education and training to make sure that that is reiterated and people have an opportunity to go through the process, whether it's in an exercise type of environment or other, but to make sure that they have the ability to rehearse so they know what to do in those critical moments. And so you can see the question on the screen. Who is the first person you look to? And what we want to identify is those natural reporting mechanisms. We want to try as much as we can, if we, in a planning process, can we incorporate the natural communication structures into the crisis program, or do we need to create new ones? Creating new ones certainly is disruptive. It can be difficult for people to understand. It can be confusing. But who is the first person that an organization or an individual is going to look to? And now we need to follow that path to make sure that that person is ready to make the decisions that they need to make at their level within the organization, again, in the early phases of that crisis. So walking through this process from a logistics standpoint, from a communication standpoint, and then from a responsibility standpoint, again, we're peeling back that onion to try and understand what's going on and how do we become more effective. And so here we go for the first hour. Many of you, depending on where you came from and the different types of industries that you've represented throughout your careers, you may have heard different terminologies used for the first hour, the critical first hour. For example, in the medical community, for years and years, we talked about the golden hour. And the golden hour really was founded under the concept is if you could get somebody who is in severe medical distress, if you can get them to definitive medical care in the first hour, your success rate, or the ability to provide the appropriate services to that individual, increased substantially. And so we started to think through all of the different mechanisms of how do we get somebody from the phone call that may go to 911, to the triage, to the first responder that's on scene, to potentially other responders that are on scene, to ultimately to the hospital. How do we speed that process up to ensure that we're meeting that concept of the golden hour? The same thing occurs in a crisis. So the things that we're going to talk about in that first hour, the things that we're going to do, the actions we're going to take, become very important, and they set the tone for everything that comes after that. And you certainly can see it in the news play out. There's many, many cases where somebody will say something that then gets picked up by the media, or somebody does something that gets picked up by the media, or somebody's out of the office at the time of an event, and that comes up as part of the media reaction to a situation. But that first hour sets the tone. If we provide the right assistance to those individuals that need to be reacting right now in this moment in time, we provide the right assistance, we can greatly improve the level of success that we can have in managing through the crisis. And when we play that out over time, and certainly for those of you that are involved in public entities, you can actually watch the stock change over time, and you can see those that are effective in managing a crisis or a disruptive event. You can watch the stock price dip and then immediately start to recover, and then you can see it actually increase over time. So it's a very visible and visual representation of how well a crisis can be responded to. But it's that first hour that we're really beginning to focus more and more on. What do we need to accomplish in that first hour? How many people do we need to be involved? How do we get those people involved? How do we get the information across to each of those individuals, and make sure that everybody is coordinated within minutes in many cases, or certainly within the first hour, to provide that level of support to be able to get through and provide the tone or create the tone for the rest of the event. Some of you on the call may have seen this before. This is our maturity model, and as we start thinking, and we're going to talk more about the trends and what we're seeing in the space, but some of the things that we refer back to as we start to clear the clear the fog of everything that's been going on. How do we look at where we sit within the world of a maturity model in crisis management, business continuity, security, and others? And this is one way that we map this out, that we look at not only our partner organizations and the organizations that we're working with, but internally as well, to make sure we're best positioned to provide support at different levels within an organization throughout different phases of a crisis, whether that's prior to, during, or after. So this is a good tool for you to be able to use as well as one of your checklists for how you're doing, and rate yourselves as to the kinds of things you have in place and where you may want to prioritize for the rest of 2018 and potentially even beyond. But an important aspect of how we look at ourselves to make sure that we're doing as much as we possibly can to help our organizations. So some of the things that are happening certainly within Firestorm, and I mentioned this as a way for you to be able to leverage some of this expertise and information for you as well. We continue to review what's needed in the industry, what's going on, and how we can support all of our partners and clients. And one of the things you'll see and you'll hear, we continue to design solutions to meet the trends of the time. And for you as well, understanding those trends and how that relates to you before, during, and after a crisis. So we're going to take a few minutes and walk through some of these as far as best practices and what we see in the industry that can be of benefit to you as well. And so when we talk about end-to-end type of solutions, both internal and external, one of the first things we refer to when we talk about this, now we're referring to these solutions and how they interact with each other to make sure that they're all connected. And one of the things we find when we go in, certainly in the middle of a crisis, very difficult, but we see this time and time again, is that many of the different aspects within an organization are fragmented. Many of them are isolated or in certain verticals. They don't necessarily come together. And some of the things that we see, certainly in some cases security might manage, in some cases risk management, safety and health may manage, in some cases when we talk about insurance, that's a completely different part of the organization. But unfortunately, all of those different aspects need to be represented, and for our plans, policies, and procedures need to be woven together. It doesn't necessarily help us to write plans, policies, procedures in a vacuum and then find out we have an insurance policy on the back end that would have potentially helped or provide expertise or provided resources or recommended we did things in a certain way to make sure we can adequately manage a claim if we're not going to integrate that into our early stage plans. We want to make sure that everything end to end is completely integrated as much as we possibly can. And so some of the things that we see as we go into an event, and some of the things you'll see from Firestorm, and some of the things for you to consider, one are crisis and risk solutions. How does your crisis management program, your business continuity program, and your risk management program, how do they interrelate, and how does that work for you? From a professional services standpoint, your plans, policies, procedures, are they written in a way, and what we find in many cases, there's beautiful plans out there, but they don't mimic the actual activities of the day. And so if an event were to occur, one of the things we want to identify as quickly as possible, does your plan represent what you're actually going to do? And what you're actually going to do, is that represented in the plan? Any discrepancies between the two can cause potential issues and problems down the line. So we want to make sure that those are taken care of. From an intelligence standpoint, and this has been something that has been from a trending standpoint, continues to trend up simply because of the nature and access to data that occurs from an open source context. And so does your organization think through how do we evaluate and potentially identify risks throughout our organization? Are there ways that we can monitor that from a security standpoint, from a crisis standpoint, from a continuity standpoint, and now we're talking about weather? Do we have mechanisms to help us understand what that means for us? Do we have mechanisms to understand what it means from a potential threatening situation? Do we have mechanisms in place to understand what our supply chain looks like and so forth? So we'll talk a little bit more about those intelligence aspects, but we want to make sure and include as much foresight as we possibly can in all of our procedures. The analytical solutions, which help us to understand where we are in the world of crisis and risk. How do we benchmark against each other, organizations within our own space or across the entire global environment? How do we leverage those metrics to make sure that we're using and utilizing services in the best ways we possibly can? And how do we know we're staying on top of certain trends? Very interesting when we get into some of the data aspects of what's going on in this space and how we view different types of crisis. And one of the surveys that we have available is an impact survey, and what it does is it looks at all of the potential events that have occurred and organizations that they've occurred to, and we look at the analytics on the back end. So what type of event was it? What was the response? How effective was the response? How many people did it impact? How much of your business did it impact? And how quickly did you recover, as an example of that? So we can create metrics and understand how those mechanisms occur. So for example, in many cases, we think of natural disasters and events, tornadoes and others, as being, in some cases around the country, here in the US, we think of those as a high risk type of event. But when you look at the impacts in many cases that those have on our businesses, they're relatively low, and some of the others that may be a surprise start to become much higher impacts. So we want to make sure that we're using the data to our advantage. As we continue the security solutions, and we'll talk through some of these as we go through as well, but are we protecting our people as best we can, and we refer to reasonable person tests. But what you're seeing from OSHA, from those of you that are in the safety space, for those of you that are in the medical space, for those of you in some of the others, public service or education space, what we begin to find is that organizations, agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, OSHA and others are becoming more interested in how we protect our people from things like workplace violence. And you're starting to see those regulations come out more and more. And so that's an important part of the process as well. And then people. How do we provide the right training as we talk about that first person approach? How do we provide the right training, make sure we have the right people in the right places to make sure we can respond in that first hour? And so we'll walk through these quickly as we go through some of the things that we're seeing in the space. So from a crisis risk management, here we're talking about crisis continuity, and from an insurance perspective, as Bill mentioned before, we do follow this predict, plan, perform model as much as we possibly can to try and identify the risks that are likely to occur, make sure we have plans in place, make sure we train and exercise and on the day be able to execute on those plans to reduce the level of disruption as low as we possibly can. And so I realize in some of these there's a great deal of information available to you. As Bill said earlier, the recording of this will be put up on our YouTube channel, and you can certainly go back and review some of the information to see which is most beneficial to you and others. But what you see in the real-time crisis aspect is that there are lots of questions, and we're going to come back to communications in just a few minutes. But when we first get on a call with an organization that's just starting to experience a crisis, in many cases they're looking for that early stage coaching. And so you can see one of the terminologies we use is the crisis coach terminology, which we like in this space to provide that quick, early, immediate guidance as to what should we do right now? What should we be thinking about right now? And what we've done on our side of the house, and certainly this is something for many of you on the call as well, to think through those events that have occurred to you in recent history. And what we've done is we've taken an aggregate of many of those types of events, certainly that we see, and we see a high volume of those, but we map that out and look at what happens in the first few hours, what happens in the first day, what happens in the first 48 hours? What happens in 72 hours, the first week, the first month, the first year? And what that allows us to do from a coaching aspect when we get involved in the early stages, we get involved in the first hour, is if I were to try and think through all of the contingencies I might need for the next year in that moment is too much information for me. So we need to be able to provide the right advice to the right person in that first hour to cover the first steps. And then we'll take a step back and we'll talk about what's going to happen next, and we'll plan the next day, and then we'll plan the next 2 days. The plan itself needs to be consistent, and the messaging needs to be consistent throughout the entire crisis event, but we're only dealing with it in pieces that are manageable for everybody to address in that specific moment. Talking a little bit about people and some of the things that are happening with Firestorm, and very exciting for many of you that have known us for years, we continue to grow, and as I mentioned, we continue to look for the trends and what's happening and what's needed in our space. And so one of the things that you'll be seeing, and it's already been published, but we did acquire a company called BC Management that specializes in understanding the right people at the right time, at the right moment, and helping organizations through that. And that goes all the way through professional development for things like crisis management and risk management, which is their entire specialty. And so when you think through your staff, is it going to get bigger this year? Is it going to be reduced this year? Are there changes that are coming? Is there certain services that are needed that you're going to have to think through? This is one area certainly that we can provide assistance, but we continually develop what does this mean for the industry itself. And some of the benchmarking that they do as well and start talking about compensation studies. Where does this role fit within the greater environment? How do you get the right people involved in your organizations? And they're a great resource for that. But again, thinking through that model and why and how that's important to you. Security. So security, again, has been a very important theme. I would say all the way through 2017, it's been the theme for the past few years. As we see a potential increase, certainly in the workplace violence or in the education institute, school violence and others, the concept of that the threatening activity, or what we typically refer to as the behaviors of concern, which is a slightly different approach, but as potential behaviors of concern increase in our organizations, in our day-to-day work environments, we need to be able to ensure that we have a way to address that. And so another way, certainly from Firestorm's side, we acquired a company called SEC, a group that many of whom came from the world of Secret Service, and they have a very important role from Firestorm's side and how we're going to continue to provide the services and protect as many of our partner organizations as we possibly can. When you think through what the Secret Service agency is responsible for, the protection of people, in many cases this becomes very important to all of you as well. How do we protect our people at those points in time? So a really interesting resource that's available there. And some of the trends that you can see, and this is a little bit about the information on what's happening within Firestorm as we bring in this organization, SEC, is to make sure that we're developing the safest environments that we possibly can, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from a reasonable person test, as well as from an emotional standpoint and a human standpoint, that we're providing under OSHA's general duty clause the best possible environment that we possibly can. Very important for many of us as this is continuing to increase, this trend of security threats, both from behaviors of concern when they're reported. How do we triage those behaviors? How do we assess those behaviors? How do we ensure that we have a mechanism internally, whether it's HR that typically receives that information first? How does that information get transferred over to others that can provide assistance? And what we see in organizations, and it's been this way certainly for a long period of time, is that HR has a tendency to, in some cases they need to hold on to information for an extended period of time before they bring others in. And what we find in the behaviors of concern standpoint is that in some cases that timeline becomes counterintuitive or becomes difficult to manage the case once it has escalated to a certain point. And so making sure we stay on top of that, making sure we understand what does security really mean for us in our organizations. Many of us think, when we think of security, we certainly think of the cameras and we think of access control and others. But in many cases, what we refer to in the world of security is time. It's awareness. And when I say time, is how long does it take for somebody to get into our facility and do something we don't want them to do? And how long does it take for us to respond, whether that's through training, plans, policies, procedures, and others? If we can respond faster than an individual can potentially do something wrong, then we're in a much better position going forward. If we're not able to do that, if it's too easy to access, if we don't have the right training involved and education involved with our individuals, our staff, our employees, and everybody that works around us, we find it becomes difficult. And that's some of the challenges we're seeing, certainly from a trend standpoint, and those trends are continuing. We certainly see that continuing into 2018 and beyond. So professional services from our side, from your side, the plans, policies, and procedures, to make sure, as I mentioned, that they're as integrated as they possibly can, internally and externally. Are the assessments being done? Are you doing those internally? How are those being done? Are you getting the answers you need based on what the results for those threat assessments are? we've talked a little bit, and really the theme of this presentation is about how do you update and make sure that you're staying ahead. So are your plans updated? Many of you that have been involved in this space for a period of time, you've heard the cliche or you've actually been involved in it, and somebody will come in and ask, or you come in and ask, and you say, well, let me see your plan, and you realize when you look at the plan it hasn't been updated in 3 years, and then everybody that's listed in the plan is no longer with the organization. We want to make sure that those plans are updated as much as we possibly can. We want to make it as easy as we can to do that, but very important to be able to do that. The testing and the exercises, there's no substitute for, while education is important, awareness is important, and we structure that out, but making sure that there is an exercise, whether that's virtual, and some of you may have attended a virtual exercise by Firestorm that we do a couple times a year through a webinar type of environment. But we need to find the mechanism to ask the hard questions of ourselves and our plans, thinking through again, peeling back that onion that first hour. Are we going to be successful in that first hour? And how do we improve that? And by creating that culture, and you can see the crisis stop for those of you on the call here and through our relationship with our partner NJMEP, we have the ability to come in if you need something from Firestorm in the first hour, those services, and we call them the crisis stop services, but those services for the first hour are complimentary. So we're there with you. We want to be able to help and provide services, certainly in that first hour, to help as much as we possibly can. And so that's some of our professional services. You heard me talk a little bit about our intelligence solutions. And again, that is trying as much as we possibly can to get ahead and see what's coming at us. What we find is the closer we can get, or the further we can get ahead of this process, the better off we are at mitigating what it is. And it's the same thing with any other trend in safety and health. The earlier we know about it, the better we can address it. And so whether that's through social media searches, whether that's through analysis, whether that's through weather and analysis, whether that's through understanding what are the risks at your site, are you in a flood zone or not, or what's the risk, what's the elevation of your location versus the elevation of others, those kinds of things that we've seen occur in 2017 that have become significant events. So understanding what those things, from a weather standpoint, from an early warning standpoint, from a threat standpoint, that we're able to get as much visibility as we possibly can. Some of the analytical issues that we've seen certainly in the last year and moving forward, you'll see more and more certainly from us, and you've seen some of the things that we've already talked about here. But understanding your organizations, if there are, because of the nature of what Firestorm does and the fact that we integrate very, very quickly with many organizations throughout a year and certainly throughout the last 12 years in crisis moments, because of that, we have significant insight as to how different organizations function, how different verticals function, how different industries function, and what are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed from the different types of stakeholders that you may have within your industry. And each industry is slightly different. Each event is slightly different. But we can go back and research, and we have all of the analytical data. We actually have the largest database now of analytical support data for crisis management and risk management that's been conducted over the last 6 years or 10 years. We do about 6 different studies through BCM, who's part of us now, Business Continuity Management. The last 10 years, they do about 6 studies a year on a globalized basis for all industries. We encourage you, for those of you that are on the call that may want to participate in that, it's free to participate, and you actually get a complimentary copy of the analytical report, and you can access those through our website if you have questions or you want to take a look at what some of those reports actually look and feel like. But the data that comes out of that is incredibly valuable for all of us to make sure we're staying ahead of the potential issues and trends. And so very quickly, as we're closing out our time today, but a little bit of our methodology. And so in that early stage, that first hour, continuing with that theme, understanding the first issues related to communication, it's typically one of the first questions that come to us when we're brought in. What do we say? What do we not say? And the question always comes back to, what are we trying to accomplish, and what is this going to look like? How do we anticipate whatever it is we say now? Do we have to create contingency plans based on what it is we say? So if we say one thing, does that mean we have to create a contingency plan for A? If we say something else, do we need a contingency plan for B? And so all of that needs to be addressed. Very complex. If you haven't done this before, you've heard us talk about message maps. You've heard us talk about home bases when we refer to these. But this is typically the first question that comes to us in the middle of the early phases of a crisis. So you can see the 3 C's there, making sure you're using those throughout your thought process for your plans, policies, procedures as well. The earlier you can understand and start thinking through the communication strategy, the better. As you heard from us before, we follow the predict, plan, perform model. We want to make sure that everything is integrated, everything makes sense, everything is coordinated as you possibly can within all of the different verticals of your organization, and make sure that the person, as we break this down into the core, that first hour, those 1 or 2 or potentially more people are ready. So we started with the quote, and certainly we end with the same quote, but that thought process of preparing for the fork on the road, going through a bit of spring cleaning for all of us on the call now with where we are, use the maturity model, understand what's going to become important to us from a trending standpoint, and trying to stay ahead of those trends in 2018. So what's next? For those of you on the call, and if the information is of interest to you, you can download a brief of today's session. You can always go and look at some of the other assessments and tools we have on our website, as well as other webinars for additional information. And finally, we do regularly put out a newsletter. In fact, we do a weekly newsletter for many people that discusses the kinds of things that we've experienced throughout the week, or that you may be thinking about because you've seen it in the news or some other industry or somebody else has referred you to a piece of information. It's those kinds of things that we can continually highlight, bring up, and provide best practices. So we always encourage everybody to register for that newsletter as well, and provide feedback and insight for how that information is helping you. So as we close out today's session, I certainly want to thank everybody for being part of it. I want to thank you for the time. I know it's important, and it is an important topic, and I realize it's difficult for everybody to get away, but certainly appreciate your time today. And again, want to turn it back over to Joe and Blair for just a minute to say some final comments. So Joe?
Thanks, Hart. I'd just like to remind everyone that NJMEP, in conjunction with Firestone, offers a no-cost risk assessment on a business for any manufacturer in the state of New Jersey, and they can take advantage of that by just going to njmep.org or to firestorm.org and just request the risk assessment. Blair, I don't know if you have anything to add.
All right, we may have unfortunately lost Blair in the connection challenges there.
No, I'm sorry, I just had everyone on mute there. Again, thanks, Joe, for making that comment. One thing just to reinforce from Hart's message is that as you're looking forward in the year, I know there's a lot of discussions we've had with a number of clients in the latter part of last year about compliance changes, and there's just this sort of a growth in just all industries, not just manufacturing, to do with changes in compliance and certifications. And I know there's been, the ISO 9000 has changed and has been driven to a risk-focused model. I know doing some work with, people who are dealing with the DoD and some of the NIST standards. Again, the standards are changing to include a risk assessment, risk-based model. I know some of the manufacturing in the automobile industry has changed as well. So it's a good time to sort of look and say, how do those kind of standards, whatever standards you're having to be compliant to, how are they changing? how are they affecting you, and the trend seems to be much more of a understanding risk in your business, how it affects your business, and it's a good time to maybe think about if your next certification's coming up, how might that change the existing model? And again, that's where Joe can come in, and Joe has the resources to help you with those. And if it's a matter of understanding the risk piece of it, that's where we can help as well.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Well, again, I want to thank everybody. We are here to help if there's ever a situation that you need from us, but we always look forward to hearing your feedback on any of our channels. Please feel free to connect with us. We look forward to seeing you at future events and future webinars. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Take care. Thanks, Art. Bye now.
Thank you.